right, everybody around, good afternoon. I can see, I'm Steve Swift from the Intelligence Project. So on behalf of our team at the ISP, our colleagues at the Clemens Center for National Security and the Strauss Center for International Security, welcome to our first public event of policy. Intelligence analysis making sense of the complex world. Great content, great speaker. Before I introduce our guest, let me pass along two short program notes. First, I encourage anyone to visit the ISP Strauss and Clemens Center website. Sure you want a mailing list so that you can be notified about events like this. We intend to host throughout the academic year. Second, I encourage our students and our guests to join us next Wednesday at the Anna Harvard Alumni Center, the UT's National Security Career. Right, so between 10 and 2 o'clock, there are going to be about 24 federal and state agencies, as well as private employees. They'll be available to discuss internships and full-time positions. And we know because we know this works, people get internships, they get jobs, they tell us about it during the year, and we ask them, how did you find these people? Where did you meet? And they say at the UT Career. We're doing this early in the year, so there's time to process applications, do security clearances. Very excited to meet you. So put a suit on, brush up, polish up your CV, rehearse your 30-second elevator talk, and go down there and meet some interesting people and find out about your career opportunities. Now, starting at 11 o'clock down at the Anna Harvard Center, we invite you all to take a seat in the Connolly Ballroom with your keynote remarks by Ambassador Clint Williams. Those principal and a colleague of mine. For those of you who don't know him, he's currently the lead coordinator for the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group for Ukraine. Following Clint's remarks, there'll be a panel discussion discussing aspects of the war in Ukraine, featuring visiting and local experts. See it here today. Well, with our neighboring colleague, General Vince Brooks, will be participating in that. And that'll be a lot of fun. I'll be there listening. You should be too. Now, we're fortunate to have you to host the Weissgold. He retired several months ago after serving as CIA's Deputy Director for Analysis. And I can't think of a equally qualified, thoughtful, more widely respected professional who can explain the challenges and opportunities that face the agency's analytic network in 2023 and beyond. Linda joined the CIA in 1986. It was a great year for CIA. Anyway, she was an analyst and leader of analytic programs focused on the Middle East. But after the 9/11 attacks, Linda volunteered for counterterrorism assignments and later headed CIA's Office of Linda then, for some inexplicable reason, decided to wreak havoc with circadian rhythms. And so for more than 2 years, she served as President George W. Bush's PDB, which I know he may talk about, but we should certainly get into this question. But really a unique opportunity to talk to somebody who spends every morning 6 years with the President of the United States, explaining the world and sharing the best products from our intelligence. So that's really good. We're happy to have it. Linda has agreed to talk for a few minutes from notes, extemporaneously, entirely up to her. And then she's agreed to field our questions. So think about what you'd like to ask. Make sure your questions concise, of interest to everyone in the room that you and the question at the end. Please welcome Linda.
Good, everybody. Let me get myself set up there. Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that incredibly warm welcome. I could have probably used about 10 degrees less warm here in Austin than I've received. Yes, at least that. And I thank you, Steve, for the invitation to come down here. Now, I'm hoping that many of you in the audience are interested already in government service. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to explain why I think your country needs you. Having been part of American intelligence for almost 4 decades, the profession means an awful lot to me. Now, for those of you who aren't yet thinking of government service that are here, maybe today's chat can help change that. And it will have been worth coming down to the blast inferno for that. Given the number of agency officers who hail already from the University of Texas, I can say confidently that Longhorns have found great success in the intelligence fields. Now, my intent today, as Steve said, is to share a few thoughts and then open it up to questions. I already know what I'm going to say, which means for me, the most exciting part of this is what you're going to say. So I'm looking forward to it, and please don't be shy. Being able to explain why you think what you think is a key part of CIA's analytic tradecraft, which I'll get into in a bit. But with that in mind, I first want to explain why I said that I think your country needs you. Now, I believe that every person who ever had my last job of running the CIA's Directorate of Analysis, including me, has said at some point that the world is getting more complicated. And I'm pretty sure we've all been right. Now, I say it because I believe that in the years to come, with many states and societies, there is likely to be a persistent and growing gap between what citizens demand and what governments can deliver. And there is an increasing mismatch between global challenges and the organizations meant to deal with them. In other words, the international system, including the organizations, alliances, rules, and norms that have existed since roughly the end of World War II, is poorly set up to address the current and looming global challenges. Things are changing rapidly. China, for example, no longer just wants a seat at the table. They want to be the head of it. Beijing wants to change the international order, and they are having some success. The PRC is seeking to overtake the US in every domain, and its rise has been remarkable. It is the biggest geopolitical challenge for the US as far into the 21st century as any of us can see. It is already a rival with more reach in more domains than we have ever faced. Now, not only do we face the military and ideological competition that we saw with the Soviet Union, with China, we are also facing technological competition, economic competition, competition in space, and competition in cyberspace. At the turn of the century, China was nowhere close to being a global leader in technology. Now it's a leader in AI, drones, hypersonic, and web applications, just to name a few. And they want to set the standards for their use and development. Now, I believe the risk of China using force against Taiwan becomes higher the further into this decade we get. The PRC is studying the lessons of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and almost certainly has concluded that you don't achieve quick, decisive victories with underwhelming force. You have to control the information space, shore up your economy against sanctions, and do everything you can to drive wedges between the US and its allies to limit coalition building. Meanwhile, the declining powers like Russia prefer to upend the table rather than lose their preferential seating and influence. Russia's actions in Ukraine are indicative of this trend. President Putin shows no real desire to compromise on Ukraine, continuing his almost obsessive desire to punish Ukrainians for moving closer to the West. He is intent on wrecking the country if he can't control it. And if Ukraine won't crack, he believes that the West will. So we should expect more nuclear saber rattling if he doesn't believe he is gaining momentum. Now, other global players, be it in the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, Asia, they're all hedging their bets to avoid losses and to try and exploit opportunities as they emerge. This is leading to both new partnerships and efforts to preserve ties without alienating rival powers. And as if all this isn't enough, some transformation, like technological changes, are occurring at a scale and a pace that make it almost impossible to predict the sweeping effects on states and societies. While the drivers, like, say, the introduction of AI are known, the widely distributed nature of bottom-up change makes it almost impossible to monitor in its entirety and to forecast accurately. But I'm confident in saying that shared global challenges, including disease, financial crises, terrorism, migration, food insecurity, all of those are likely to occur more frequently and intensely in almost every region and country, producing strains on states and societies, as well as shocks that could be catastrophic. So, before you run screaming out of the room, there is something that I believe you can do, and that's government service. I knew in my heart when I retired from CIA a few months ago that I had made a difference. And I wish whatever you all end up doing in life that you can say that same and have that same sense of satisfaction. Now you may ask, why are you so sure? Well, for the better part of 4 decades, I provided objective assessments about the world to some of the busiest and most influential people on the planet in order to give them decision advantage and to keep Americans safe. It was my job as an analyst at CIA to go beyond what was happening and to examine why it was happening and the implications of that. In a nutshell, that is what CIA analysts do every day, no matter who is sitting in the White House or where our warfighters are. Now, I was extremely lucky to see firsthand a correlation with what CIA provided and keeping our country and my loved ones safe, whether it was helping to thwart terrorist plots or as a briefer, watching the President of the United States pick up the phone and take action after a briefing. Now, trust me, the national security advisors never really liked when the president turned to them after a briefing and said, so what are we doing about that? But it happened every day. Despite what you may have read in the press, I can also assure you from personal experience that every president since Ronald Reagan, who was in office when I joined CIA, has turned to CIA analysts to avoid surprise, understand foreign adversaries' intentions, and explore opportunities. Now, others before Ronald Reagan did that, but I'm just not that old to have experienced it firsthand. Every president is different, and it was our job to adjust to their preferences, not the other way around. So I always had 2 metrics that I used to judge how we were doing in supporting a president. And those were, did he make time to interact with intelligence? And did he ask questions? Now, how presidents interact with intelligence differed, but they all made time on their calendars. And some preferred to take briefings and others preferred to read by themselves, but they were interacting with what we had to say. Now, when I became President George W. Bush's intelligence briefer, I was always mindful that his calendar was blocked in 5-minute increments. The 30 minutes or more that he spent 6 days a week taking a briefing could have easily been reallocated to other issues. The fact that it wasn't, and the comments that he has made to me personally, demonstrate that he found value in hearing our analysis. Now, Bush, by the way, liked to pepper his briefer with lots of questions, and he was not alone in that. When I say that every administration has turned to the intelligence community for its views, they've asked us questions. Now, that doesn't mean that they always accepted what we said, but that's okay. The intelligence community is never a policymaker's only source of information. And CIA is not there to be policy prescriptive. Success in my mind is that they want to hear what intelligence has to say, and they factor that into their decision-making. Now, serendipity brought me to CIA, and I'm happy to tell that story if folks are interested at some point. But although it does predate any kind of CIA website, and so isn't totally applicable now, and I hope you all have checked out CIA's website, cia.gov. Folks there work really hard to make sure that it gives you some insight into what it really is like to be an officer at CIA. But for me, it was the mission, the culture, and the people that kept me at CIA for as long as I was there. And so I thought I'd touch a little bit on each of those in my talk. Now, as I mentioned, the heart of CIA's analytic mission is to deliver objective assessments about the world to some of the most important people in it. CIA looks at individuals, groups, events, and trends beyond our borders that affect our national interests and those of our allies. And while this may be self-evident, I do feel a need to say it, because there are unrealistic expectations on the part of the press and Congress and others that often they often seem to have of intelligence analysis, and that is that nobody, not even the best intelligence analyst, can eliminate surprise. And not even the best intelligence analysts are always going to be right. The only way to do that is to never make a call, and that's not helpful. Now, I like to say that CIA analysts rely on three kinds of privileged access to do their jobs. The access to the time, thinking, and goals of our country's leaders. This helps analysts to understand what customers need to know and when they need to know it. You don't ever want to be there telling the president something important just after he has made a decision. Then the appearance is either that you don't agree with what he had to say or his decision, or you were not in tune enough to know that the policy cycle, what was going on. Neither of those is a good place to be. The second privileged access is access to a vast range of information, both classified and unclassified, which is often acquired at real risk and cost. This provides the raw material from which new insight can be developed. And finally, access to CIA's reputation. This ensures an opportunity to be heard. These are all grants of trust, not power, and they must be used wisely in accordance with American law. And there is accountability for CIA, including from Congress. But I've always thought that the strongest safeguard against error comes from within each CIA officer. So the CIA is looking for people to join their ranks who combine strong skills and strong values. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But first, let me talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of intelligence analysis. It's not about making complex things simple. It's about giving those served, starting with the president, new ways to think about dangers and opportunities around the globe, whether the topic is enduring, emerging, or way over the horizon. And I've already said that I think intelligence analysis is a form of public service, but it's also a form of customer service. Analysts pride themselves on being responsive to questions, and I mentioned that there are a lot of those. But analysts actually initiate the overwhelming percentage of analysis that is delivered. They are proactive, not reactive. To be useful, the substantive expertise of analysts needs to be tied to a bias for action. The idea is to help the government not only handle the present, but also prepare for the future. That means being on top of what they need to know now and surfacing what they'll need to know down the road. I often said that getting the policymaker to focus on the long term is some of the most difficult work that we do. And by long term, I mean somewhere beyond the 4 to 8 years of a term. I used to call that making a policymaker eat their vegetables. There is a tremendous amount of judgment involved and a tremendous amount of difficulty in analysis. After all, the government doesn't need CIA analysts to deal with the obvious. Intelligence territory is the unknown, the uncertain, and the deliberately hidden. So how do you do it? This is where that mix of skills and values that I mentioned earlier comes in. You are learning some of it here at UT, I know, and I'm quite fortunate at that. But a lot of CIA's analytic tradecraft touches on standards, how to think critically, how to weigh raw information that is often contradictory and almost always incomplete, and how to assemble and test arguments. Also, how to use words and visuals in ways that are clear, concise, and compelling. And I emphasize that visuals part. Some of our presidents have been very visual learners. President Bush was a visual learner. He could look at a graph I had stayed up all night looking at, and within 2 minutes ask me questions like, why doesn't that pie chart add up to 100? And I'd have to admit I had totally missed that. One of my predecessors spent hours looking at a map prior to briefing President Bush, and it was something having to do with the Balkans. And the map was a topographical map that the whole point of it was to show this one group had taken the high ground. And so he had asked himself all kinds of questions to be ready, like how high were the mountains and all these kinds of things. Only to have the first question President Bush asked him was something about, was the river at the bottom of the map navigable? And he had to admit he hadn't even seen the river, right? Because he was so focused on the rest of the map. The tools and the techniques used during my time as an analyst have evolved. and they must continue to do so. Now, I actually remember a time when you could hit the next document key on your computer and there wasn't one, all right? There weren't any more things to read that morning. That could never happen today. Now it's all about finding the right information. So now we have a vibrant group of data scientists and AI to help navigate the oceans of information. Now, while the tradecraft evolves, the values endure. Beyond a commitment to quality, a prime value for CIA is objectivity. It's one of the reasons that President Truman established CIA more than 75 years ago. CIA analysts don't make foreign policy or conduct operations. They inform those who do. They're analysts, they're not advocates. They do not push for specific decisions or outcomes. Now, while that might sound like a limitation to some, I actually always thought it was a strength. Because as analysts, much of your credibility and influence comes from objectivity. Those that CIA serve must be confident that the analysts are not pushing for a course of action, but rather calling things as they see them. Analytic judgments must reflect the best information and the strongest tradecraft, but never personal opinion. Now, when I became POTUS's briefer, nobody ever asked me who I voted for. The only question that was asked was, could I take the heat of being in a briefing? Remember, I said President Bush liked to pepper his briefers with questions. That's how it should be. It shouldn't be about who you voted for. They should be confident that what you're delivering is the objective analysis from the IC. Now, it's a serious responsibility, and it's not easy to tell policymakers things they don't want to hear. But CIA's reputation, part of that privileged access that I mentioned, can be enhanced or hurt by every product. Now, I tried never to forget that, and I'm mindful of it today as well, as the actions of formers, as we like to call ourselves, are also part of that reputation. So let me give you a quick example of what I mean about how every product matters. And why we have to be able to explain why we think what we think, or why we said what we said. And also why good tradecraft is so important to our reputation. So I once went into the Oval Office, and I should say, as a briefer, I used to come in at midnight, get up at 12:01 so I could trick myself into saying it was Wednesday morning. And I'd come in and it was kind of like cramming for finals every morning. Trying to make sure that I understood what the analysts were trying to say to the president, and that I had enough information to be able to answer that first or second order of questions that were coming. So I was really kind of studying. And one morning, and I used to say that the day I would go into the Oval Office and I wasn't a bit nervous was the day I shouldn't go in, because I was too tired to be realizing the import of what I was doing. But one day I go into the Oval Office, and before I can even get started with my briefing, President Bush stops me and he tells me a little story. And he says that the day before he had met with a world leader, and he had given this world leader a protocol gift of a bowling ball, only to have this world leader turn to him and say, "But I don't bowl." So the president, I'm going to clean this up a bit, the president was chagrined. And he asked his staff, he asked his protocol staff, why the hell did I give this guy a bowling ball? And they helpfully turned to him and said, because CIA said that he was an avid bowler. So the president of the United States is looking at me at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I've been up all night. And he said, why the hell did you say that? Why did you get it wrong? First, let me give you all a tip for those of you who are going to be doing briefings in your classes and things. Never try to bullshit a president. The right answer is, I don't know, sir, but I will find out. So I have to still do my whole briefing, and the whole time in the back of my mind, I'm going, I hope we used our tradecraft, that we know why we said what we said, because clearly we got it wrong. So I went back and I asked the analysts, and they had done exactly what they were supposed to do. And within minutes, they could tell me that not only on the guy's webpage when he was running for office had he said that he was an avid bowler, he said he was the president of his local bowling league. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So I went back the next morning to the president and I told him that. And I also told him, don't worry, we've added to his leadership profile that he's not gracious. So, now, I know decisions about protocol gifts may sound a bit mundane. But I often used to tell this story to the analysts at CIA, to new analysts, as a reminder about the importance of every product. Because if we're unable to explain our thinking on something small, why should the president believe us on the big calls? Now, given the difficulty of the job, another important value for analysts is humility. You need to make clear all the time what you know, what you don't know, and what you think you know. Talk about how solid the information is and where the intelligence gaps are. Always be aware of what you aren't seeing and why, including the possibility of deception. In fact, probably the most important question that an intelligence analyst can ask, in my opinion, is how might I be wrong? That kind of transparency is part of the contract with those that CIA serves. Policymakers should not have to take on faith what we say. Fueled by the lessons of what we have done well and where things fell short, the relationship with customers has evolved to become a much more of a dialogue over the years, and I think that things are better for it. Now, pushback and controversy are the occasional price of relevance, and another thing that I think CIA analysts need is a thick skin. You need to have the integrity to defend your analytic judgments and be ready to explain how you reach them. But you also have to have the flexibility and I guess the humility really to revise those judgments when new information dictates. And that takes me to teamwork, which I think is a value that is connected to both objectivity and humility. To have an openness to perspectives from others is a defining feature of good analysts and good analysis. Having colleagues who challenge what you think and share data that you might have missed, it's a gift. It improves the rigor and the reach of your assessments. And we have to be able, as an organization, but also as a country, I think, to be able to push each other and then still be able to go out for a beer afterwards. Now, as an agency, CIA has come light years from the days when there were literally walls between analysts and intelligence collectors. The organization is far more integrated now than it ever has been. But that doesn't mean that we do each other's jobs. It means that we support each other, chiefly by exchanging ideas and information. And that's the goal, and I think it's paid off. It has improved analysis and operations without undermining the objectivity of the former or the security of the latter. So let me just close by saying that while I started by painting a very bleak picture of the challenges ahead, I'm actually very optimistic about the ability of CIA to continue to give our country a powerful advantage, the advantage of insight and foresight in dealing with the turbulence and the dangers of our times. Analysts, along with officers from each of the other directorates at CIA, are innovators on an industrial scale. And as I said to my former colleagues when I left, I know I'm always going to be cheering for them from the sidelines, and I hope that you all will be too. Some of you joining, and perhaps some of you just, like I said, cheering from the side. So with that, I want to take this in the direction that you all would like to go, and I'll open the floor up to questions. You're going to be brave, and who's been thinking?
Hi, how are you? Carlton Haley, I'm a postdoc at the Diplomat Center. Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering if maybe as the first question, I could have you speak more about the relationship between the intelligence community and not necessarily the customers, the policymakers, but the sponsors, the American people. For those of us that grew up in a generation between the success of the Cold War and maybe the success of the intelligence warning about Ukraine and whatnot, the history of the CIA was marked with a lot of controversial elements, right? A lot of disclosures and whatnot, maybe colored a negative view of the agency or the broader IC for folks coming of age in that generation. So what would you say to a group of undergraduates in the room here that are maybe not skeptical but questioning of the CIA, curious about what life in the CIA would be like, and still forming an opinion of kind of the the morality and the whatnot of relationship between American people, civil liberty, the CIA, and national security, right? The foundational goal of the agency.
I swear I couldn't have planted a better question.
You didn't plan.
That's right, I couldn't have. And I say that because really one of the reasons I'm here today and the reason I want to do some public speaking is exactly this. I do believe that the American people, if they were to understand better what CIA analysts and what CIA is doing, that there could be greater trust. And I realize that trust has been eroded over time. So let me say a few things about this. First and foremost, CIA is filled with your average people, right? It's filled with, and if I'm doing this talk in Washington, I often will say, the woman behind you at the grocery store could be from CIA, right? The soccer dad could be from CIA. It's filled with your average people trying to do the right thing. And I believe that people come to CIA because they want to be relevant. They want to help protect America, and that they are there doing just that. What makes it hard is they can't talk about it, particularly when you are in CIA. And so I think I'm going to have an easier time, I believe, as a farmer, to be able to talk a little bit more about it. So that would be the first part. It's your average US citizen who is trying to do right. It's also hard because if you are maintaining classified information like you should, you can't always argue against what is out there in the press that's incorrect. It's a little bit like I was talking about that, you know, if you listen to the press, you would think that a number of presidents didn't care about what the intelligence community said. That's wrong. I think you hear a lot about CIA's failures. You almost never hear about CIA's successes, and that's the way it should be. But it's hard. So I'm hoping that the more that folks can meet with people who have worked at CIA, like you have the opportunity here with your professors, to be able to see that there is really a sincerity and a real effort to try and do right, that will help increase faith and trust in the organization. My hope is that CIA also, we need to come clean. When we do make a mistake, we admit it. We just marked, as you know, kind of the anniversary of the Gulf War. And there were a lot of programs at CIA as a learning experience to talk about what we had done wrong, but also a lot of public speaking being done about what went wrong in that decision on weapons of mass destruction and what didn't. And so we're a learning organization. And I believe that, you know, we learn from our mistakes and continue to improve. But I'm also open to ideas. If you all have ideas of how we can improve that relationship with the American people, right now the proxy is congressional oversight. And I'm a big believer in congressional oversight. But oftentimes even that, the American people don't see because it's done at a classification level in ways that the American people just have to count on that we're being asked the right questions. But I'm open to ideas, but that's part of the reason I'm here today. Yeah. There are questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Annabelle Sala, MGPS student here at LBJ. So I'm wondering, when you're talking about teamwork, what is the team environment like within the CIA? Are you working with a small team on the day-to-day on very concentrated issues, or is it more of a larger team environment where you're working on a broad range of issues with a lot more people?
Just in case people couldn't hear that for the video, I'll repeat just a little bit about more questions about what's teamwork like at CIA. Is it big teams, small teams? It's a combination of all of that. So most of our analysts have what we call an account. So whether that's you're covering a particular country, a particular transnational topic, like or a particular region. So maybe you're a weapons system analyst, or maybe you're a Middle East analyst. My first account that I worked on Lebanon, and I was a Lebanon political analyst. There were also, it was a multidisciplinary team. So there were folks who worked on Lebanon, Syria, the Levant, as it's called, who were military analysts and who were economists. And we had leadership analysts, and we were all on a team together, working those issues. So most of the best products that we write are often multidisciplinary, because it's not just about what the politics are, it's, you know, how is the economy affecting the politics and all of those. But then you have maybe a bigger team. So maybe you're looking through the concept and through the lens of I'll use Iran as an example. If you're looking at Iran political, or Iran nuclear issues, you need the nuclear experts. So you might reach out to the team of folks who are more of our nuclear experts writ large and bring them in. The teams are also, on some products, are throughout the intelligence community. So for some products, we'll bring together experts from across the intelligence community. So folks from DIA or states INR and others together. So that teamwork is really important, to be able to, as I said earlier, to have the reach to check each other's work, to come up with new ideas. Sometimes you want to pull in people who have absolutely no background in what you're working on, as part of brainstorming sessions, to just have them think through creatively. So we have people who run structured analytic techniques that will come in and bring together a little bit more of a disparate team and help you think through issues like what should we be talking about, or how might we find out information? What kind of proxies are there for information where we have gaps? So there's a lot of different teamwork that happens in that way. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, man. My name is Derek Carver. I'm in a second year MGPS. Next year is a presidential year, and there's been some conversations. Not gonna be a political question. There's gonna be some conversations about the structuring of the CIA, in particularly the separation of the intelligence analyst portion with the clandestine mission operation portion. I was just curious on if you thought that was a good thing, potentially bad thing, and how you see that impacting the mission in the future.
So the question was about, kind of as we enter into election season and perhaps in the future discussions about further separation between analysts and operations. That question comes up regularly within the halls of Congress, often because it has to do with that objectivity issue. The belief is that analysts would be overly influenced or cowed, if you will, perhaps by their operational colleagues. And I think Steve can attest to this. That means they haven't met analysts. If anything, I think our analysts, they will go the exact opposite. When under pressure from somebody to perhaps not be objective, we just buckle down and it reinforces the idea of our need to be. So we had a lot of that discussion with Congress when the CIA moved in 2015 or 16 under Director Brennan to a much more integrated format where we created mission centers, which are combined operational and analytic units covering the world. And Congress was really nervous about this. And I went down and talked quite a bit with them about a couple of things. One, the analysts make the call on an analytic judgment. The operations officers make the call on operation. That doesn't mean you don't want their views. Like, why wouldn't I want the view of an operations officer who has lived in the region, knows key officials there, all of that, and kind of seek their thoughts on things, but they don't get to make the call. Just like they should be reaching out to analysts and saying, hey, I've got this operation. What do you think? Is it going to work culturally? How is the best way to approach this? And analysts might say, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. But it's the operations officer's ultimate call on whether or not to go through with that. So you want that outside perspective. I think it's also important, though, to note a few things like the getting into kind of nuts and bolts. You were talking about teams and other things. The performance evaluation for all of our analysts goes through only other analysts. The review of product goes through an analytic chain. It does not go through a chain that includes operations officers or others. So we try and make sure that we're keeping that separation, if you will, to maintain that objectivity. If we have people who are working on covert action, if we have analysts who are working on covert action, they are never involved in a piece that we write that would talk about how well that covert action is working or not working. Because that gets too hard to basically be grading your own work. And so we do have some firewalls built in to the system to try and maintain that objectivity. But I actually hope that there will continue to be that conversation so we can, again, getting back to your point, try and reassure the American public in an open way about how we do our work so that they know that the analysts are out there actually saying what we really think what's happening in Afghanistan. Or, we say things all the time that are unpopular. It's not easy to do, but that's our job, is to do that. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Peter Cleves. I was head of a center here in the university, not dealing with intelligence, but so I come with a question from the outside.
Okay.
Probably the biggest debacle in American foreign policy in the last few years was the pulling out of Afghanistan and what happened at the airport. One could anticipate that there were two positions that came to the president. One was, this is going to be a cakewalk, and the other was, this is going to be a disaster if it's done this way. It turned out to be a disaster. Following up on your previous statement on what the CIA does with respect to analyzing analytical work, how do you think the aftermath of that played out in the community?
So the question was a little bit about, just to repeat it for folks, looking at what happened in Afghanistan, and information that could be delivered to the president about that was either going to be a cakewalk or going to be a debacle. How did that play out afterwards? I mentioned earlier that we're never the only source of information for a policy decision. And so presidents and other policymakers get lots of input. And then they also have their own views and they have their own policy goals. And so all of that gets factored in. On Afghanistan in particular, I think you had a range of views within the intelligence community, some being more dire than others. And that information is presented. And I think the important thing is to not try and get to a least common denominator, to help a president understand why some analysts think one thing and other analysts think another. And that gets back to what I said earlier about one of the most important parts of being an analyst is to be able to explain why you think what you think. Are you placing greater emphasis on a particular source or past history or whatever it might be? Whether Ghani is going to stay or whether he's going to go and how. So they are given this information. I think, it's important to note that no matter what was being said on Afghanistan in particular, the slope of the line was always downward. It was just a question of how fast things were going to go badly in Afghanistan was part of the debate. So I think that, we did what we could to be the ones to be able to explain some people think this and some people think that, and here's why that's the case. I think overall, though, one of the the after effects of this has been to think about even more, what is it that goes into whether a military is going to, particularly ones we've trained, or other governments, what goes into their staying power or not. So, if you try and look at what happened in Afghanistan or previously in Iraq and try and apply that to Ukraine or maybe Taiwan in the future, and really try and dig into what are the key elements of a military staying power or government staying power. Again, we're a continuous learning organization. We've been trying to do that both as a community, but also within CIA, even before I left. So I think that's part of it. And the idea, as I said, that personally, policymakers make decisions all the time that analysts don't agree with. And that's our role is to accept that they made that decision and to then move on and move to the next thing. Okay, you made that decision. Here's implications, here's what's happening, here's how that's going, those kinds of things. Did that get to your question?
Yep.
Yes, ma'am, all the way over in the corner.
Hi, my name is Avery Krasankowski. I am an undergrad student towards my degree in government. It's my first year here. And I was wondering if there's anything specific you can recommend getting involved with as an undergrad to be a better candidate for a government position. Would you recommend studying learning the language, getting a internship in Washington? Like what should I prioritize?
So the question was, do I have any tips and ideas for undergraduates in particular who might want to think about the field of intelligence? And so yes, language is great. And for any number of reasons, depending on what field you want to get into, and I'll use CIA as the example. If you wanted to be an operations officer, of course, the language is great. You certainly you'll be able to relate and engage more with someone in their native language. As an analyst, the ability to understand the culture, to read things in the vernacular, really important. If you're going to be, and I do try when I talk to make sure that I highlight some of the other directorates of CIA, because not knowing their own background, but we need logisticians and finance officers and others to make sure that we are supported overseas or can hide money as we move it. They're actually like legal money launderers, right? And all kinds of things. So what I often say is the most important thing is to pursue a passion, something you're passionate about, right? So there isn't a particular course because we hire people with all kinds of expertise. I think it's important to show that you're interested in intelligence, read some books, be able to be conversant about that. I think showing that you're interested in international affairs is important, regardless of what your major is, if you're interested in national security. But again, overall, I always say choose something you're passionate about, because at least as an analyst, I can teach you some of the trade craft about being an analyst. What I can't teach you is expertise in the Middle East or quantum physicist or whatever it is that hydrologist. I had all of those people working for me. And so find something you're passionate about and really like, because if you're going to join the CIA, you're going to be allowed to be able to go really deep into that. And so I think some of there are things at the career fair you'll hear that might echo some of that and maybe a little bit more. I guess let me just add one other quick thing. For those of you who might be considering applying or have applied, my patented little tip that I try and give people is to remember that at CIA, the folks who are actually doing the recruiting to hire people, they're not professional recruiters. They are officers who have stepped away from their job for a year or two to help bring in the next generation. So with that in mind, a couple of things I think are relevant. One, they can't help but in the back of their mind be thinking, do I want you sitting in the cubicle next to me someday? And so there is something about the teamwork and the collegiality and thinking about them as people, and because they're thinking about you as a person. The other thing that I think is really important is some of you may self-censor or feel like you need to self-censor a little bit about your patriotism and the reasons that you want to go into national security. I don't think you need to, because those are the same reasons the people sitting across from you are there. It will resonate with them if you talk about why you want to work at CIA, and that includes the patriotism, the keeping your loved ones safe, because that's why they're there. So don't feel the need to self-censor. And the last tip is, though, we've worked really hard, like I said, over the years to put things out on a website and to help you really understand and sending people to career fairs and other kinds of things. So you can help really understand more about what the job is, because it's important for it to be the right fit. We invest a lot in officers who come to CIA. And so we want to make sure, CIA wants to make sure as much as we can that it's the right fit. So show that you've done some research. And when you're talking to the recruiters, use that research that you've done to talk about why you and why this job, why you want to be a leadership analyst, or why you want to be a military analyst versus just, hey, I think this would be really cool to work at CIA. So the more you can talk about how you think your skills and passion apply to a particular job, I think the more you'll stand out. You're welcome. Thanks, ma'am.
Hi, ma'am. My name is Desiree. I'm a first year MGPS student here. And my question to you is in reference to the protocol gift story, what does disinformation and misinformation, what effect does that have on the analytical tradecraft?
Yeah.
And also for those larger projects versus the smaller ones?
I had the opportunity today, so for those of you who I met with at breakfast this morning, sorry, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit. As a CIA analyst, you don't read the news the way other people do. My husband and I have had many a conversation about that. My husband was a military analyst for us. You actually read the newspaper and open source looking at what's not there, or not taking things at face value. I take almost nothing at face value. Because, and it doesn't mean I don't believe it so much as, hey, I want that verified, or I'm gonna go look at some other information, and you kind of vector to kind of figure out whether something is real or not. But you always have to be mindful of misinformation and disinformation that's out there. And so you just can't accept it. So, you know, you really don't want to be writing based on just one source. You want to be thinking about how that information, could someone have put that information out there as a way to influence rather than inform? Knowing the difference between an opinion piece that someone writes versus an actual, you know, more factual piece is important. So we teach a lot of that as part of our trade craft, is to think about the misinformation and disinformation that might be out there. So I think that would be part of it, but it's, a lot of it is critical thinking. It's reading the information in a way that might be wrong. Now, in hindsight, I can think of a lot of reasons why that guy's website actually said he was an avid bowler. Maybe it wasn't even him. He probably didn't even know it was on his website. But his campaign staff may have been trying to make him more of a man of the people, and put that on there. So again, there was no reason for the analyst to doubt it. But in retrospect, it's a great example of even something as mundane as, does the guy like to bowl? Could be wrong. So you have to work that into it. Yes, ma'am, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm Dakshita. I'm a senior here at UT. I'm majoring in government and criminology. I was wondering, personally for you, what drew you to work for the CIA rather than other governmental organizations in the US? And once you were there, what was the most surprising part or something you didn't expect as part of your experience working for the CIA?
So I'll start with the last part. Your question was kind of like, what drew me to CIA as opposed to other organizations, and then, if you will, what kept me there. So as I mentioned in my piece, I think what was the surprising thing that kept me there? If someone had told me when I first started at CIA that I would have had the career I had, the opportunities I had, I would have laughed. But for me, what actually I think was, I'm an intellectually curious person. My mother says that as soon as I started to talk, I started asking questions and never stopped. And I found an organization that actually paid me to learn. That the idea that I could continue to develop expertise and ask questions and be surrounded by people who could actually help me answer those questions, that was intoxicating for me. That was something that really made me want to be there. So I think the surprise for me was all of the opportunities that came my way. I never thought I was going to be the president's briefer. I never thought I'd have as many opportunities to go overseas as I did, to brief presidents and kings and all kinds of stuff. Yes, so I think that was the career goal. What drew me to CIA, I mentioned earlier, it was total serendipity for me, which is not the right answer for you. A lot has changed. As I said, we didn't have a website, we didn't have that ability to talk to people very often who had been at CIA. But I always knew I wanted to do something international. That was the first part. So when your question was why CIA rather than other domestic US government agencies, CIA had that international focus, right? I mean, we are prohibited from looking at things inside the US. You have that beyond our border. So that really, I think, was for me, I knew I wanted an international focus. I don't in any way disparage any other organization. So there are many ways for you all to contribute. For me as well, CIA as an all-source organization was something that was important. CIA gets up every morning. It's probably, along with ODNI, it's the only organization in the US government that gets up every morning and still thinks, what are we going to tell the president today? Other parts of the intelligence community, they contribute to that, and they may have occasionally something they want to tell the president, but the Defense Intelligence Agency sees as its primary customer the Secretary of Defense and the combatant commanders. The state's INR, it sees as its most important customer the Secretary of State. These are very important customers, but I wanted to have that broader. I get to see all of those as my customers, as well as the president, as well as the operations officers. So I like the broader sense of CIA's mission. Others? Yes, sir.
Larry O'Brien, alum of the LBJ school. As you talk to the students about potential careers, you had a successful multi-decade career at the CIA. These days, it's a little bit more unusual for someone to spend decades in one place. Are you equally open for students coming in to spend a few years parachuting in as analysts for a few years and then move on to other areas of the government or other private sector careers?
Question was, I'm paraphrasing, was it unusual that you stayed as long as you did? And is CIA open to the idea of people coming and not perhaps making it a lifelong career? First part of it, it is not unusual at CIA to have people be there for decades. And part of that is, I think, as I said, we spent a lot of time up front trying to see if this was the right fit. But also, you don't have to leave CIA to do something different. So you can be a CIA officer, work on the Middle East, go overseas, do something, come back, maybe you go down and you do a rotation at the National Security Council, actually being a policymaker, still being a CIA officer on rotation. Maybe you're going to go to language training for a while. By the time you add all that up, of all the different kinds of things you can do as a CIA officer, decades have passed. And so there's a lot of satisfaction. Now, the idea of whether or not we are more open now to having people come for shorter periods, I think we have to be. I think CIA has to be. I keep using the word we because it hasn't really sunk in yet that I'm not a we, I'm a them. But I think that CIA has to become more open to that idea because CIA has been saying for decades, we thought that time would come where people want to move more often. And I think that may be here now, particularly in some fields like cyber being an example. So yes, I think CIA has become more open to the idea of, say, a cyber analyst coming in, spending a couple of years, 5 years or so, working at CIA. Hopefully they get hooked, but if they don't, maybe going off and working in the private sector for a while and then maybe coming back again. We've had that happen where folks go off and realize that they missed the mission and they will come back. So, but the organization needs to work a bit still on how to do that, how to have that openness. I had been looking at this idea while I was running the director's analysis to think through things like, well, if I'm only going to bring someone in for a couple of years, do I give them the same level of training that we give analysts that we're expecting? And if I don't, am I creating two classes of citizens? Because if I'm going to spend almost a year of time training you and you're only going to be there for 5 years, maybe that's not the best use of time. Part of efforts that are ongoing right now at CIA to engage more with the private sector include more opportunities for analysts, just like they're doing, or for others, just like they're doing rotations, maybe as a policymaker, to go on a rotation to the private sector. And on certain fields, you need, I think, that injection every once in a while of what's going on in the outside world to catch up, to keep current. So there's efforts underway to try and have more internships with the private sector. So there is innovation going on and trying to think of how to do that. That being said, you know, when you get, regardless of whether it's CIA or any other organization, when you get a top secret clearance, you've been given access to the nation's most sensitive secrets. And there are things that go along with that, that will last your entire lifetime. So when I want to give a speech, I still have to get, that has anything to do with work that I did at CIA, I have to get that cleared. When you are an active duty officer and you have a top secret clearance and you're going to travel overseas, you need to tell the agency you're traveling overseas. That's for your own protection. So there are things that go along with that. So I've thought about this and I thought, is someone going to want to come to the agency for a couple of years and still be subject for decades afterwards to anything you write about on that topic you're going to have to put in for clearance? I don't know. So maybe we have to think through even more of some of the implications of what does it mean to be on a short-term track, if you will. So.
This will have to be the last question, for when you move on.
Yes, sir.
How do you grade the performance of analysts, especially things like predictions in the future, both like broad and down to the individual?
So the question was, how do we grade analysts, particularly on predictions on the future? As I said, even the best analyst is not always going to be right. And so it's not about, did you make a mistake? Because you will. I think it's more about the tradecraft you used going into, like, how did you reach your conclusion? That is what we grade you on. So the critical thinking skills that went into that, the use of sources and methods that went into that, so your tradecraft. Analysts are also graded or rated on their briefing skills, the concision of their language, the idea that, how insightful you are. So it's not necessarily that so you're coming up with ideas for topics to write on that you think the president needs to know. And remember, there's a lot going on in the world that the president actually doesn't need to know about. It's an analyst's job to help sort out what is it that the president needs to spend his time on and why. So always being able to say, why did you think that 5 minutes or 10 minutes he spends on something is worth it? And so we are rating people on that. There is discussion about the teamwork and the skills to be able to work together with people. We rate people on their openness to information. Some people, again, if it's language skills, so on your substantive expertise, that's important. And are you continuing to develop it? So there's a lot that goes into the rating of an analyst. It's not necessarily about were you right. Now, if you were right, and you made some prescient call, like, hey, the guy who made the call, initially it wasn't just one individual, but Putin's going into Ukraine. We really mean it. He's going into Ukraine. He may have gotten a bonus that year. Right? But yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. So, well, I want to thank you for the opportunity. I hope that, as I said at the beginning, that if you were already thinking about government service, that you're thinking even harder now if you weren't. That maybe I inspired a few of you, and for those of you who are in the audience who are past looking for a job, I do hope that maybe I was able to, as the gentleman said, inspire a little more trust with the U.S. intelligence community. So thank you again.